Hello, and welcome to the Maryland Balance of State Coordinated Entry New User Training. This video will discuss continuums of care and will hopefully help you better understand how homeless service systems organize themselves. This training will be successful if you can walk away knowing answers to the following questions. What is a continuum of care? Who makes up a continuum of care? What specific roles are there within a continuum of care? How does a COC accomplish its goals? And what is the Maryland Balance of State? We're also going to keep a whiteboard of new terms that we use along the way. It is blank now, but we'll fill it up as we go. First, what is a continuum of care? A continuum of care, or COC for short, is defined by HUD as a community plan to organize and deliver housing and services to meet the specific needs of people who are homeless as they move to stable housing and maximize self-sufficiency. It includes action steps to end homelessness and prevent a return to homelessness. In the past, most federal funding for homelessness would go directly to specific nonprofit organizations to run shelters and to local public housing authorities to run subsidized housing. These agencies would directly control the landscape of homeless services, but there was little input and coordination from the various community members affected by these resources. HUD wanted to see these communities come together and develop a local strategy for tackling homelessness, rather than the siloed and uncoordinated structures of the past. In 1987, the federal McKinney-Vento Homelessness Assistance Act was passed. This was the first federal law specifically addressing providing housing as a solution to homelessness. In 1995, HUD required communities to submit a single application for McKinney-Vento grants rather than having each service provider apply directly for this funding. This was in an effort to streamline the funding and to encourage communities to create local plans to address homelessness. This new ethos of collective responsibility would evolve over time into continuum of cares as we know them today. In 2009, the Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing Act, often abbreviated as HARTH, was signed into law. This further consolidated HUD's competitive grant programs. And then finally, in 2012, HUD announced the COC Program Interim Rule, which codified the basic structure and duties of the continuum of care as we know them today. The goal, again, is to have individual communities take responsibility for managing their response to homelessness, rather than having individual nonprofits and government agencies running the show in a silo. So we can get a good hint about what continuum of cares are from the history. COCs were intended to centralize the funding application process, but there is so much more that they do. They promote a community-wide commitment to ending homelessness. They provide a forum for community members to make decisions about the best approaches to resolving homelessness. They decide the community's priorities, including which programs to fund and which programs not to fund. They serve as the public face of the area's collective response to homelessness. They optimize programs, including promoting greater self-sufficiency among individuals and families experiencing homelessness, create streamlined systems to prioritize people for housing through a coordinated entry system. They also use data to keep track of program performance, gaps in services, and the needs that are not being met. They also develop a long-term plan to address homelessness. Next, we'll discuss who makes up a continuum of care. A continuum of care is made up of many members of the community, including nonprofit homeless services, victim service providers, faith-based organizations, governments, businesses, advocates, healthcare agencies, school districts, social service providers, mental health agencies, hospitals, universities, affordable housing developers, law enforcement, veteran services, and then other agencies that serve people experiencing homelessness, and most importantly, people with lived experience of homelessness, either current or former. So we've learned the collective term continuum of care, often called a COC. Now let's add that to our whiteboard of new terms that we are using. Next, we'll discuss the specific roles within a continuum of care. We just talked about who is in a continuum of care, a whole lot of people representing a whole lot of organizations. However, there are also specific roles within a continuum of care. In some cases, an entire agency may take on these responsibilities. A prime example of this would be the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD. DHCD serves as the collaborative applicant. In other cases, people from various organizations come together to fulfill particular responsibilities, such as in the COC board or in work groups. It comprises members of diverse agencies and backgrounds who collaborate to make decisions. So let's get into it. The first role we'll talk about is the COC board. The COC board is the guiding body that makes decisions and decides the direction of the continuum of care as a whole. The COC board is required to be representative of the entire COC and include at least one homeless or formerly homeless person. The responsibilities of the COC board will depend a lot on the community. In some, the board itself has a lot of hats to wear, in others less so. However, all of the responsibilities are required to be documented in the COC's governance charter. The COC board can also establish work groups and subcommittees around specific practice areas. These entities are laid out also in the COC's governance charter and vary a lot based on the COC. Common work groups you'll likely see are the Rating and Ranking Committee, which ranks funding applications to decide how the COC will disperse its funds. There's also the Coordinated Entry Committee and the Data and Performance Committee. Another important role is the collaborative applicant. This is one particular organization that the COC designates to apply for HUD funds on its behalf. Often the COC will also grant the collaborative applicant various other roles and responsibilities as well in its governance charter. The Maryland Balance of State has designated DHCD as its collaborative applicant. We at DHCD then do our best to get as much funding from the federal government as possible to bring back to the COC to run our programs. There's also the HMIS lead. HMIS stands for Homeless Management Information System. You may be familiar with this acronym from your work. This massive database is used in day-to-day operations of tracking clients, overseeing program performances, and ensuring that the system is properly optimized. The HMIS lead agency is an organization that manages the day-to-day operation of the COC system. So now we've learned a bunch of new terms: COC board, HMIS lead, and collaborative applicant. Let's add them together to our whiteboard now. Our next topic is to discuss how a COC accomplishes its goals. We've already discussed some of the key roles that different people and organizations play in overseeing the work of the COC. But now, let's talk about some of the key concepts that you'll probably hear if you spend a lot of time talking to COC folk. First is the NOFO. NOFO stands for Notice of Funding Opportunity. Remember that one of the key goals of the COC is to have the entire community apply for funding from HUD together. Well, the NOFO is the process by which it accomplishes that goal. The NOFO is put out by HUD and informs the COC that there is new funding available to apply for. When a NOFO is announced, it is a pretty big deal, and the collaborative applicant specifically will often be working around the clock to put the best foot forward of the COC to HUD in order to get more funding. The NOFO has two parts: the COC planning grant for operational costs, and the COC project funding, which is for important project types like permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, joint component transitional housing and rapid rehousing, coordinated entry support services only, and HMIS. If some of these project types don't ring a bell, don't worry, we'll discuss them more in a future video. This is just a friendly preview of what's to come. Next, we'll talk about the term the annual competition. Where the NOFO is a competition between continuums of care nationwide, the annual competition is used within the continuum of care to determine which programs to fund. Individual COC programs are awarded funds through this process, and the amounts that each program get are determined by how much of the community as a whole received on the recent NOFO. The next term we will learn is point in time count, often abbreviated as PIT. This is a homeless census that HUD requires all COCs to conduct. It consists of a physical count and a survey of people staying in shelters and on the streets in a homeless community. HUD requires that a PIT count be conducted every 2 years, and the results nationwide are reported directly to Congress. The PIT helps us track long-term trends in homelessness and can help get a sense of the number of individuals that are homeless and not interacting with our system. Alongside the point-in-time count, HUD also requires that COCs conduct a regular housing inventory count, often abbreviated as the HIC. Sometimes you will hear people talking about the HIC and the PIT together, but they are separate things. The PIT captures people in our system, while the HIC counts the number of units that we have in our community. We now have 4 new words to add to our whiteboard of new terminology. Let's add them now. We've learned about the NOFO, the annual competition, the point-in-time count, and housing inventory count. All of these terms represent important concepts that you'll likely hear from working with continuums of care. Finally, we will discuss the Maryland Balance of State. But first, we should probably define what a balance of state is before we understand what the Maryland Balance of State is. The term balance of state, or BOS for short, refers to a continuum of care that comprises areas of the state that do not have their own COCs. This is often because the geographic area is large, often rural and non-contiguous. So the balance of state is a type of COC, just one that is a bit larger, a bit more rural, and encompasses a lot of smaller communities where it wouldn't necessarily make sense to form its own COC. When COCs merge to form a balance of state, the balance of state itself becomes the COC, and the former COC is now called a local homeless coalition, or LHC for short. An LHC organizes and oversees services for its county or region, but shares power and responsibility with other communities to increase everyone's capacity. We'll add this term to the whiteboard now. Maryland has a balance of state which comprises Garrett, Allegheny, Washington, Cecil, Harford, Frederick, Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's counties. The Maryland balance of state began in 2019 when HUD-TA met with various Maryland COCs. It started with just 5: Garrett, Allegheny, Washington, Cecil, and Southern Maryland. Please note, Southern Maryland was a pre-existing COC that comprised of 3 counties, Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's. So, in 2020, all 5 of these COCs decided to merge into the COC balance of state. In 2021, the first ever balance of state NOFA was initiated, alongside the first PIT and HIC counts, as well as annual reports. Then, in 2022, a 6th COC joined, Harford County, and the balance of state expanded its COC and HMIS capacity. Finally, we arrive at the present, in 2023, unless you're watching this video from the future, of course. In 2023, Frederick County joined the balance of state. 2023 is also the year that we are launching our coordinated entry system, often abbreviated as CES. Hopefully that is why you're here watching this video, but we'll discuss the nuances and details of coordinated entry systems in a future video. But in the meantime, we will add it to our whiteboard of definitions. As I mentioned before, the Department of Housing and Community Development serves as both the COC and the HMIS lead agencies. These are terms you should be familiar with now. We also work with Team HMIS to provide direct admin of the system. We are also composed of local homeless coalitions, or LHCs. This is another term that we learned. These are comprised of the county and regional level organizations that run the programs themselves. Here's a list of all current COC board members as of 2023. Notice that each LHC has representation, as do state agencies such as the Department of Housing and Community Development, Labor, Education, Health, Veterans Affairs, Disabilities, and Human Services. If you're a member of an LHC, please take a moment to find your local representative. The Balance of State's mission is to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. We define rare as being able to prevent homelessness as much as possible, reduce the number of people in shelter and on the street. Brief means that transitioning out of homelessness and into permanent housing happens as quickly as possible. And non-recurring means that permanent housing placements should be stable and adequate, and community supports should be in place to prevent a return to homelessness. Thank you for watching. In the next video, we'll give an introduction to the coordinated entry system and